Hi, my name is Daniel Raymond Gosling, and I'm a filmmaker and visual effects artist. I recently created a Spider-Man short film, which I made in the style of my animated series, Bulletproof Hearts. This was done to further develop the art style, as well as test it out in animation. This is why today I've decided to try something different. I will be redesigning 3 Spider-Man villains in the Heart style, as well as rewriting their stories to fit within the universe of my short film. This won't be a tutorial or very technical, but instead a broad overview of my design process. Who knows? Might be fun. But before we start the villains, let's first take a look back at this story's hero. In this story, Spider-Man, or Peter Parker, is 20 years old and has been a crime fighter for 4 years. He has grown somewhat jaded to this life and doesn't have much of a social one. He comes from a more realistic universe, so his powers aren't as sensational as other versions, but he still packs a punch. So I wanted to go with a more grounded, realistic take inspired by Matt Reeves' The Batman, so his suit is far simpler in its construction than most depictions, with the idea being what could a broke young adult that doesn't so much realistically make. I was inspired a lot by the various homemade suits, as well as Ben Reilly's Spider-Man suit, as I always liked how the logo was done. The spider logo here also took inspiration from the Danger Days cover art. I think the design came out really well in the Heart style. Now, on to the villains. Alexei was a common thief who had an embarrassing encounter with Spider-Man shortly before being arrested. A few days later, he was bailed out by a mysterious man who claimed to be a scientist. He offered Alexei an experimental performance enhancement drug, seemingly for no reason. Before leaving, he advised Alexei to don something more theatrical. With his new powers, Alexei began robbing banks, and plans to one day settle his score with Spider-Man. The idea behind this design was to base his costume on an American football player, which led to the idea that the team he supports would be the Rhinos, so their helmets would have horns on the top. I tried to stay close to the real life reference, but I'm not a sports guy, so you can tell me how well that went. Rhino is not typically a very colourful character, but since it's supposed to be a sports team, I decided to add an olive green, as I thought a natural earthy colour would fit his jungle aesthetic. It wasn't a terribly difficult character to model, but I did have to experiment a bit with his materials for the plastics and metals. And this was the final result. In the wake of his father's passing, Harry Osborn would assume control of his father's company, and face much backlash. He would eventually be voted out of the company. Then after discovering his best friend was secretly Spider-Man, Harry snaps. He meets up with an old Oscorp scientist who gives him a new version of a performance enhancement drug. The new drug increases his strength, agility and endurance at the cost of his sanity. Harry would then steal Oscorp's experimental flight gear and start terrorizing his father's company. Spider-Man would eventually stop him, but the Goblin would escape, vowing revenge on all those who wronged him. This character was fun to design. I thought a lot about how we would piece this look together. The base is a blue flight suit with a torn orange hoodie over the top to create that classic Hobgoblin look. I based his shoes off of skiing boots to imply that they connect him to the glider. My idea for the face is that he's wearing a Halloween mask that he bought from a shop. I contemplated giving him a cape, like he usually has, but I didn't think the character would care enough to add one. His theatricality is only used to disguise his identity, which a cape wouldn't really contribute to. For the glider, I immediately knew I wanted something inspired by a drone. After some research, I found that someone else had the same idea and built it in real life. Since I knew that design actually worked, I would heavily base my version on it. And this was the final result. Dr. Curtis Connors was a genetic scientist who worked at Oscorp. 5 years ago, he was fired due to his growing obsession with his lizard project despite it being rejected. He would accept a job at a university as a lecturer and continued his research in secret. Then one day he finally finished his formula, and in desperation he used it on himself. A few weeks went by and nothing really happened, but then suddenly his arm started growing back. It would take about a month before his arm fully regenerated, but it was far from human. During that time, he started experiencing other weird side effects, such as his hair falling out, or his ear and fingernails falling off, and he grew claws and his teeth began to sharpen. His skin would turn green and scaly, and he would even sprout a tail. Connors would very quickly regret his decisions, and vowed to find a cure before he would lose his mind. But does a cure even exist? This was the most interesting character to tackle, as he's not one that lends himself well to realism due to the whole turning into a big lizard monster thing. I decided to base my version of the lizard off Cronenberg's The Fly starring Jeff Goldblum, which is a story where a scientist begins turning into a fly after teleporting with one. The film is truly horrific as we see Seth's mutation slowly play out on screen. I'd imagine that in this story he would further change and eventually turn into a more classic depiction of the lizard, if not more horrific, but I like the idea of keeping the lizard aspect more subtle. I was most worried about this one, but I'm quite happy with how it turned out. So these are my Spider-Man villains. I quite enjoyed making them all, and I'd like to do more redesign projects in the future, or maybe even adapt some of these ideas into another short film. I'd love to know what you all think. Do you want to see more of this sort of stuff? And if so, who do you want to see redesign next?